The world woke up on February 28, 2026, to a sound that will echo through history books for centuries. In a coordinated lightning-fast strike, United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a military campaign of a scale and intensity unseen since the dawn of modern warfare. In less than 1 hour, the geopolitical architecture of the Middle East was systematically dismantled. 200 fighter jets in a formation dubbed Genesis swept across the Iranian horizon, striking over 500 targets simultaneously. But this was not just a campaign against infrastructure. It was a surgical decapitation of a regime that had stood for nearly 5 decades. At exactly 9:27 in the morning, local Tehran time, the skies erupted over Pasteur Street. 30 precision munitions tore through the fortified compound of the supreme leader, collapsing the very rooms where Iran's top military and political command had gathered for an emergency meeting. Within hours, the unthinkable was confirmed. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was dead. From his residence at Mar-a-Lago, President Donald Trump did not wait for a formal Oval Office address. Instead, he released a 6-minute video that bypassed traditional media, speaking directly to a global audience. His message was blunt and uncompromising. He declared that one of the most evil people in history was gone and issued a chilling warning to the remnants of the Iranian leadership. His words, "The end is near," signaled a fundamental shift in American foreign policy. He was no longer talking about containment or nuclear deals. He was demanding unconditional surrender. Trump's vows sent shockwaves through global markets and sparked a frenzy of activity in every capital from London to Beijing. The president argued that this was justice for decades of bloodshed, but critics and allies alike were left gasping at the speed and audacity of the escalation. As the smoke rose over Tehran, the American administration painted a picture of a regime in total collapse, claiming that thousands of Iranian soldiers were already calling for immunity. However, beneath the surface of this perceived victory, a more dangerous reality was beginning to emerge. While the head of the serpent had been severed, the body was already twitching with a new, terrifying life. The intelligence community soon realized that their calculation of a quick, Venezuelan-style surrender was dangerously flawed. They had destroyed the Central Command, but in doing so, they had triggered a defense mechanism that had been 20 years in the making. Overnight, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps changed its strategy completely. They abandoned the traditional hierarchy that the U.S. had just decapitated and activated something far more difficult to hit: the Mosaic Defense. This decentralized system turned 31 different provinces into autonomous war zones, capable of launching devastating strikes without needing a single word from Tehran. As President Trump sat in his ad hoc situation room, surrounded by generals and high-tech monitors, he believed he had won. But in the shadows of the Iranian mountains, the IRGC was unveiling what they had built in secret: a network of ghost launchers and hypersonic missiles, designed to ensure that if the regime went down, it would take the entire global economy with it. The shift was total, the stakes were existential. And for millions of people across the Middle East, the nightmare was only just beginning. The destruction of the Central Command in Tehran was intended to be the killing blow, a final curtain call for the Islamic Republic. But the architects of Operation Epic Fury soon realized they had merely unlocked a door to a new form of chaos. By removing the top leadership in a single morning, United States and Israel inadvertently activated the most resilient phase of Iran's military doctrine: the Mosaic Defense. This was a sophisticated, decentralized approach that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had been meticulously perfecting for over 20 years. The entire nation was divided into 31 autonomous units, provincial war zones, capable of launching devastating strikes without needing a single word from Tehran. Even with the supreme leader gone, lower-level commanders were granted the authority to act independently, launching operations with lethal autonomy. This weapons-free mode meant there were no longer red lines to respect or a centralized chain of command to negotiate a ceasefire. What they had built in secret was now being revealed through the orange glow of rocket fire. Intelligence reports confirmed that Iran possessed one of the largest and most diverse missile arsenals in the Middle East, including over 2,000 operational ballistic missiles. But it was the technology that shocked the Pentagon. The IRGC unveiled the Vows series, a hypersonic flagship missile capable of reaching Mach 15. These weapons were engineered to make advanced air defense systems look obsolete. Even more troubling was the appearance of decoy swarms. Advanced re-entry vehicles began deploying dozens of cheap replicas alongside real warheads, confusing the radar of Patriot, THAAD, and Arrow systems. Each time an Iranian launcher emerged from a hidden facility, it forced the defenders to fire multiple interceptors just to stop a single threat. This was the core of what the Israeli military called the drizzle strategy. Instead of a single massive barrage, Iran launched missiles at a slow, relentless pace, forcing their adversaries to burn through limited stockpiles of expensive munitions. A single interceptor missile can cost millions of dollars, while the Iranian drones being used as bait cost only a fraction of that. The math of the war was shifting. Analysts estimated that in just the first 4 days, United States had already spent over $5 billion on interceptors. This depletion became so critical that President Trump called an emergency meeting with heads of defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, demanding they quadruple production immediately. While Trump claimed a virtually unlimited supply of weapons, his own commanders were sounding the alarm. Tension inside the White House reached a breaking point between General Dan Kane, the Joint Chiefs Chairman, and Admiral Brad Cooper of Central Command. Kane, a reluctant warrior, had warned about the complexity of the operation, while Cooper pushed for maximum execution. They were facing a ghost army inside missile cities carved deep into mountains, protected by hundreds of feet of reinforced concrete. These subterranean cathedrals, such as the facility at Fordow, housed thousands of centrifuges that satellites could not monitor. As the U.S. surged a third aircraft carrier, the George H.W. Bush, toward the region, the question was no longer about the first strike. It was about how long the American people could sustain a war against an enemy that had spent decades preparing to be decapitated. As the smoke cleared from the initial assault, the true cost of this sudden escalation began to paralyze the international community. The clinical precision of the B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, which had traveled 37 hours round trip from Whiteman Air Force Base, had seemingly achieved its objective. They had dropped the largest conventional weapons in the American arsenal, the 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, into the very heart of the Fordow enrichment facility. These bunker busters were designed to thread the needle, entering primary ventilation shafts at supersonic speeds to detonate deep inside the mountain where centrifuges were spinning. President Trump proclaimed that the nuclear program was obliterated, but intelligence analysts at the Pentagon were looking at a much more haunting set of satellite images. Just 3 days before the bombs fell, 16 cargo trucks were photographed loading materials at Fordow's entrance. 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity material just weeks away from weapons grade had vanished into the night. The United States had destroyed the buildings, but the program was now on wheels, mobile, and hidden in a network of 30-plus secret sites that no Western satellite had identified. The response from the wounded IRGC was swift and indiscriminate, turning the entire Middle East into a unified front line. Tehran's retaliation, named Operation True Promise 4, rained ballistic missiles and drones down on 6 Arab nations and Israel simultaneously. In Bahrain, the headquarters of the U.S. Navy Fifth Fleet took a direct hit. In Dubai, the iconic Burj Al Arab Hotel caught fire after being struck by drone debris. The most devastating blow for the American people came from a makeshift facility in Kuwait, where an Iranian drone strike killed 6 U.S. service members. Among them was 20-year-old Sergeant Declan Cody from Iowa, a young man who died in a conflict that Congress never formally authorized. While the White House dismissed reports of outside help, classified briefings revealed a chilling new dimension. Russia was now an active participant in the shadows. Moscow's massive space-based surveillance apparatus was reportedly providing real-time targeting data to Iran, allowing their cheap drones to find and strike American assets with terrifying accuracy. The humanitarian reality on the ground was even more grim, shattering any narrative of a clean or ethical war. A single missile strike in the southern Iranian town of Minab hit a girls' primary school during the start of the work week. More than 160 people, mostly young students and their teachers, lost their lives in the rubble. While the Trump administration argued that Iran was using civilians as human shields, the images of those children fueled an unprecedented wave of anger across the Muslim world. The Middle East was no longer witnessing a surgical strike. It was experiencing a regional conflagration. In Tehran, the streets were filled with people, not to protest the regime, but to mourn the martyrs. The economic taps of the world were being shut off as the Iranian Revolutionary Guards blocked the Strait of Hormuz. Global oil prices surged past $90 a barrel, and gas prices at American pumps saw their largest single-day rise in years. The end that Trump had promised was near, but it was looking less like a victory and more like a global economic catastrophe. While the world watched the fires in Tehran, a new and perhaps even more dangerous chapter was being written inside the fortified bunkers of the Iranian regime. Inside closed rooms, despite the ongoing bombardment, the assembly of experts moved with a speed that defied the chaos, filling the leadership vacuum created by the death of the supreme leader. They announced the appointment of the third supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. Mojtaba Khamenei, the 56-year-old son of the man the United States had just assassinated. This was not the moderate transition some in Washington had hoped for, but rather an act of absolute defiance. Mojtaba is described as a hardliner who adopts the uncompromising positions of his father. Regarding both the United States and Israel, as a shadow influencer with deep connections to the military and the security apparatus, his elevation signaled that the regime was not preparing to surrender, but to escalate. President Trump publicly branded the new leader a lightweight and insisted that any succession must be consulted with him. But the reality on the ground told a different story. The regime was closing ranks, and for the first time, they were being backed by a superpower alliance that threatened to turn a regional conflict into a global one. Intelligence reports confirmed that Russia had entered the battlefield in the shadows, providing Iran with critical space-based targeting information. Moscow's massive surveillance apparatus was reportedly being used to track American warships and military bases, feeding real-time data to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. This coordination explained the sudden, terrifying precision of Iranian drone strikes that had already claimed the lives of 7 American soldiers. At the same time, China remained Iran's economic lifeline, purchasing 80% of its oil in yuan and reportedly preparing to provide the spare parts and missile components necessary to keep the Iranian war machine running. Back in Washington, the domestic political landscape was transforming into a combat zone of its own. The initial silence in Congress had been replaced by a roar of opposition as the cost of the war began to settle in the minds of the American public. A series of devastating polls revealed that a majority of Americans now disapproved of the military action, with the president's overall approval rating cratering to an unprecedented 27%. Congressional leaders, citing the lack of constitutional authorization and the absence of a clear exit strategy, began fast-tracking articles of impeachment. The House leadership pointed to the sworn testimony of top officials who admitted that evidence of an imminent threat had been unsubstantiated, suggesting the country had been dragged into a war of choice based on a sham justification. As the political walls closed in on the White House, the global economy was entering a state of shock. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical energy choke point, saw practically zero traffic for the first time in 80 years. While the waterway was not physically closed, the threat of Iranian mines and missiles had effectively shut down the flow of 20 million barrels of oil per day. Risk insurers submitted cancellation notices for ships in the region, And gas prices in the United States climbed by 43 cents in just 1 week, the largest increase since 2022. For ordinary Americans, the war was no longer a headline from a distant land. It was a structural catastrophe appearing at the gas pump and in the grocery store. The end that President Trump had promised was indeed arriving, but it was not the end of the Iranian regime. It was the beginning of an era of global instability and economic ruin that no one was prepared to manage. As the conflict entered its second week, the sheer scale of the kinetic exchange began to reveal a terrifying industrial reality that few had anticipated. While the Pentagon boasted of striking over 3,000 targets and effectively vaporizing the Iranian Navy with 43 ships sent to the bottom of the ocean, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is proving that it had built a defense system specifically designed to absorb such a blow. What they had built in secret were massive subterranean missile cities carved into the Iranian mountains. Some buried hundreds of feet beneath solid rock and reinforced concrete. These facilities were not just storage sites. They were autonomous launch complexes linked to the Mosaic Defense strategy, which allowed local commanders to continue the fight even after their central leadership was killed. This decentralized structure created what military analysts called a tactical abyss for the United States. Even as Israeli and American pilots established air superiority, they were forced into a game of door camping, waiting for mobile launchers to emerge from mountain tunnels, only to find themselves targeting decoy swarms designed to waste their most expensive munitions. The economic asymmetry of this new phase of warfare was staggering. Iran began utilizing its drizzle strategy, launching a slow but steady stream of cheap, mass-produced Shahed-136 drones and ballistic missiles. These systems cost as little as $20,000 apiece. Yet they forced the United States to fire Patriot and not interceptors that cost millions of dollars per shot. In just the first 4 days of the operation, the United States military burned through $5.7 billion in missile interceptors alone. This munitions crisis was so acute that the Pentagon was forced to draw supplies from the Indo-Pacific and Ukraine, effectively ending deterrence in other critical regions of the world. In a desperate bid to maintain the campaign, President Trump proposed a defense budget of $1.5 trillion and pressured contractors to quadruple the production of advanced missiles, admitting that the high demand was stretching the American industrial base to its breaking point. While the generals argued over munitions math, the environmental and human cost inside Iran reached apocalyptic proportions. The systematic targeting of Iranian oil refineries and storage facilities created a catastrophe that local residents described as night turning into day. In Tehran, massive orange flames and columns of thick black smoke rose from the shaken oil depot, mixing with local rainfall to create a phenomenon known as black rain. This toxic precipitation fell on a city of 17 million people, forcing them to shelter indoors to avoid lethal pollution while their sewage systems flowed with ignited oil. The Iranian regime capitalized on this horror, using heavily populated civilian areas to conduct military operations and launch drones, effectively turning their own citizens into human shields and daring the United States to strike. In a further escalation of force, the United States surged the USS George H.W. Bush into the region, marking the first time since 2003 that 3 nuclear supercarriers were concentrated in a single theater of war. The United States was doubling down on steel and fire, but the IRGC had built a strategy designed to survive the end of the world, and they were just getting started. The closing days of this conflict's second week have arrived. Yet the end that President Trump so confidently vowed remains a distant, flickering mirage. Instead of a quick, decisive victory, the world is witnessing a seismic transformation of the Middle East that may rewrite the history of the region for generations. This is the big shift. The moment when the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps abandoned traditional military hierarchies to activate a strategy designed for total resilience. By moving into a weapons-free, decentralized Mosaic defense, The IRGC has turned 31 different provinces into autonomous units that can launch missiles and drones without a single central command node. What they built in secret a vast network of missile cities and underground bunkers, carved deep into naturally fortified mountains, has proven largely immune to the most sophisticated aerial bombardments. The decapitation strike that killed Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was intended to cause a crisis and a psychological collapse. However, the rapid installation of his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, as the new leader has instead signaled a transition to a harsher military-religious dictatorship with no interest in compromise. President Trump's rhetoric of complete destruction has not resulted in the cry for uncle he expected. Instead, the Iranian regime is doubling down, utilizing a drizzle strategy of slow, relentless fire that is systematically draining the billion-dollar defense stockpiles of the United States and Israel. The economic asymmetry is staggering. Cheap, mass-produced drones are forcing the use of high-tech interceptors that cost a fortune, creating a war of attrition that Washington is struggling to sustain. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the global consequences have reached a boiling point. Strait of Hormuz is functionally closed, with shipping traffic dropping by 90% and global energy markets entering a state of terminal shock. For nations like India, which depends on the Middle East for over half of its crude and natural gas imports, the risk is existential. The big shift has also pulled global rivals into the fray. Russia's provision of space-based targeting intelligence to Iran and China's potential financial lifeline have turned a regional strike into a proxy war for the future of the world order. President Trump now faces a mounting presidential crisis as approval ratings crater to 27%, and the shadow of the Epstein files continues to fuel a domestic political meltdown. The humanitarian toll of this epic fury remains its most tragic legacy. The black rain falling over Tehran and the ruins of the primary school in Minab serve as haunting reminders that civilians always pay the highest price. While some Iranians may have cheered the fall of the leader, the mounting destruction of critical infrastructure has galvanized national resolve against foreign intervention. As the United States surges a third carrier strike group to the region, it is becoming clear that this is no longer a quick get-in-get-out operation. It has become a potential forever war, a strategic quagmire that mirrors the failures of Afghanistan and Iraq. President Trump vowed to finish the conflict, but the strategy the IRGC built in secret has instead created a logistical and economic black hole that may ultimately lead to a regime change not in Tehran, but in Washington. The end is near, but it is an end to the world order as we knew it, and the dawn of a far more dangerous era.